A racist police officer threw a brutal punch at an elderly black man inside a packed courtroom, not out of self-defense or any real threat, but out of sheer prejudice and pure abuse of power. It wasn't a scuffle. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate, hateful act in front of a silent, stunned crowd. "People like you should know better than to show your face here," the officer sneered, his voice dripping with contempt as he delivered the blow, making the old man stumble backward with blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. Gasps filled the room. Some people turned their faces away. Others whispered in disbelief. But no one moved to help. No one stopped it. Because deep down, too many of them were used to seeing scenes like this, where power and prejudice collide in public and justice sits quietly in the corner. The officer adjusted his uniform arrogantly, flashing a satisfied smirk as if he had just enforced some twisted version of order. The elderly man wiped his mouth with the back of his trembling hand, staring back at his aggressor with a gaze that didn't waver, didn't flinch. There was no fear in his eyes, only something deeper, something forged in places far harsher than a courthouse, a quiet storm, a patience sharpened over decades of surviving what others could not even imagine. That courtroom, that officer, that punch, none of it would break him. Because the man standing there, silent and still, had already endured wars far beyond anyone's understanding. He had come that day for something simple, something that should have taken minutes, to pay an unjust traffic fine issued by another officer who had pulled him over for no reason but the color of his skin. He had driven carefully. He had all his documents in order. It didn't matter. Because in certain places, and for certain people, the law bends like a weapon, not a shield. All he wanted was to settle it quietly, avoid more trouble. Instead, he found himself assaulted and humiliated under the very roof where justice was supposed to live. As the blow echoed in the minds of those watching, the silence that followed felt heavier than the punch itself. The judge's gavel never slammed. The bailiffs never intervened. The man on the ground was simply expected to accept it. Accept it the way so many before him had been forced to. But this time, it was different. Because the officer had picked the wrong man to lay hands on. He had struck a living symbol of resilience, a warrior whose battles had earned him the highest honors a country could bestow, and whose patience had just run out. Without raising a hand in retaliation, without shouting or cursing, the elderly man slowly reached into a worn leather folder tucked beneath his jacket. No sudden movements, no anger, only purpose. He pulled out papers, old photographs, and then something unmistakable, a collection of medals, badges, and citations that testified to a life of sacrifice in service to the very ideals the officer had so easily trampled. The same ideals etched into the Constitution framed on the wall behind them. "You hit the wrong man today," he said in a voice so calm it shook the room more than any scream could have. "You hit someone who bled for your right to wear that uniform." The officer's grin faded instantly, his bravado evaporating under the weight of what he was beginning to realize. Murmurs spread through the courtroom. Phones came out. Cameras started recording. The entire story began to unfold at lightning speed, but the consequences would not move nearly as fast. Because the man wasn't done. Not yet. He stood up straighter, his body aching but his spirit unbroken, and as he locked eyes with his attacker, the air changed. The room no longer belonged to the officer. It belonged to the man who had fought in wars the officer only read about in textbooks he probably never cared to open. It belonged to the man who had seen comrades fall beside him in foreign lands while fighting for a freedom he himself was still denied at home. And now, in this courtroom, he was about to fight a different kind of battle, one not with weapons, but with truth. The officer tried to stammer something, maybe an apology, maybe an excuse, but it didn't matter. His voice was nothing now compared to the roar of outrage brewing beyond those walls. Reporters were already at the door. Lawyers were whispering in corners. The damage was done. But the veteran knew that the real victory wouldn't be in shouting or even in physical revenge. It would be in revealing the truth so plainly, so powerfully, that no one could look away. No one could pretend they didn't see it. The veteran's story was bigger than one punch. Bigger than one courtroom. It was the story of generations forced to endure blows to the body and the spirit and still stand tall. It was the story of dignity in the face of brutality. Courage in the face of humiliation. Justice in the face of centuries of injustice. As he gathered his papers, the old man didn't gloat. He didn't yell. He simply turned to the judge and said, "I fought for this country. I won medals for this country. And today, I'm asking this court, will you fight for me?" The question hung in the air, heavier than the silence before it. And for the first time that day, the courtroom was no longer silent out of fear. It was silent out of shame. Out of respect. Out of the realization that something sacred had just happened, and none of them could pretend otherwise. But that was only the beginning. Because what the veteran did next would not only shatter the career of the officer who dared to humiliate him, it would ignite a movement that would reach far beyond those four courtroom walls. What secret was the veteran about to reveal that would leave not just the officer, but the entire nation, utterly speechless? Stay until the end, and witness a true story of justice finally served. Here at Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and injustice. We honor and support every black individual who faces discrimination with strength and dignity. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And today's story is dedicated to you. Stay strong, stay proud, and if you haven't yet, subscribe to Plough of Twist so you can join us in celebrating resilience and powerful turnarounds. Now, get ready for a story that will move you and inspire you. His name was Elijah Carter, a name whispered with respect in neighborhoods where few heroes wore medals and even fewer lived long enough to tell their stories. To most who knew him casually, Elijah was a quiet old man, the kind you might pass by in a grocery store without a second glance, with his neatly pressed shirts, slow, deliberate walk, and a tired kindness in his eyes. But beneath the modest exterior lived a man whose life had been carved by battles far harsher than any courtroom drama, a man who had faced death under foreign skies and returned home to face a different, quieter kind of war, one fought with glances, with lowered voices, with doors shut quietly in his face. Elijah had grown up in a part of Baton Rouge where opportunity was a rumor and justice was a myth. He learned early that hard work would not always be rewarded and that dignity, once stripped, was rarely returned. But he had a stubbornness in his bones, an old fire inherited from ancestors who had survived even worse. That stubbornness led him to enlist in the army at 18, escaping the walls that tried to close in around him. It was there, amid the choking dust of faraway lands, that Elijah learned the meaning of brotherhood, sacrifice, and honor. He became a soldier's soldier, the kind who didn't flinch under fire, the kind who carried others when their legs gave out. His return home was not met with parades or gratitude. There were no handshakes at the train station, no banners across Main Street. There was only a quiet kind of erasure, a world that preferred to pretend men like Elijah didn't exist, or if they did, that they knew their place. But Elijah knew his worth, even if the world didn't. He built a life out of the scraps given to him, finding honest work, raising a family with a woman who matched his fire and his patience, and living by a code that didn't bend to the ignorance around him. Now, at 74, Elijah carried the years like a heavy, dignified cloak. His hands, scarred and calloused, still worked steady when fixing the old Buick parked outside his small, neat home. His eyes, behind thick glasses, still scanned the world with the sharpness of a man who knew danger when he saw it. He didn't talk much about the past. He didn't need to. The medals tucked away in a dusty box on his dresser spoke louder than any story he could tell. On the morning that would change everything, Elijah had no reason to expect trouble. The sun broke lazy across the rooftops of Montgomery, Alabama, where he had moved a few years earlier to be closer to his granddaughter, Maya. The city wore its history like a deep scar, a place where every brick seemed to hum with the ghosts of marches and battles fought not with rifles, but with feet pounding pavement and voices lifted against injustice. Elijah had made peace with Montgomery in his own way, seeing it as both a reminder of how far things had come and how far they still had to go. All he had to do was show up at the courthouse downtown, pay a fine for a traffic violation he knew he didn't deserve, and head back home before lunch. The citation had been another slap in the face, a young officer pulling him over for erratic driving, when he hadn't driven over 30 miles an hour the whole way home from church. Elijah didn't argue. He had long ago learned the dangerous futility of arguing when your skin spoke louder than your words. So he signed the paper, accepted the date, and told himself it would be over soon. The courthouse was a tired building with peeling paint around the windows and a metal detector that groaned under the weight of bureaucracy and neglect. Inside, the air was thick with the stale scent of old coffee and fear, the kind that lingers where justice is supposed to live but often hides instead. Elijah moved through it patiently, his step steady, his paperwork neatly tucked under his arm. It was in that waiting area, amid worn-out chairs and buzzing fluorescent lights, that he first crossed paths with Officer Travis Miller, a man who wore his badge like a crown and his prejudices like armor. Miller was young, but not too young to know better, broad-shouldered, thick-necked, with a smile that rarely reached his eyes. He was the kind of officer who had learned quickly that a badge gave him power but never bothered to learn that it also came with responsibility. And when he saw Elijah standing there, dignified but small in the grand architecture of law, something inside him twisted. "Hey, old man," Miller had barked loudly enough for the room to hear, "you lost or just trying to look important?" Elijah, used to these petty humiliations, said nothing. He had spent decades mastering the art of silence in the face of disrespect. But Miller wanted more. He wanted a reaction. Because men like Miller weren't satisfied with silent submission, they craved visible humiliation, public displays of power. When Elijah didn't respond, Miller closed the distance between them, a sneer curling his lip. "Don't you know better than to just stand around here? This ain't no museum, and you ain't no hero." The word stung sharper than the slap he expected next. In Miller's mind, Elijah was just another invisible man, someone whose history and humanity could be erased with a joke, a shove, a punch. And in that toxic brew of arrogance and hatred, Miller threw the punch, fast, hard, reckless, driving his fist into Elijah's jaw and sending him staggering back against the cold marble wall. Gasps erupted. The security guards at the metal detectors froze. The clerks behind the glass windows looked away, pretending not to see. No one moved. No one stopped it. The world kept spinning, as it had so many times before, leaving men like Elijah to gather their dignity off the floor by themselves. But this time, something was different. Elijah didn't crumble. He didn't lower his eyes. He didn't shuffle away. He straightened slowly, wiping the blood from the corner of his mouth with the same hand that had once cradled dying friends in muddy battlefields half a world away. His body, though older, remembered what it meant to stand when standing seemed impossible. His heart, though battered, remembered what it meant to hold the line when the world demanded surrender. Across the room, Miller's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to something else, confusion, maybe fear. Because instead of seeing an old man beaten down, he was staring into the unbroken spirit of someone who had already survived worse and was about to remind everyone exactly who he was. Without a word, Elijah adjusted his jacket and walked steadily toward the courtroom doors. He carried with him more than paperwork that day. He carried history. He carried truth. And he was about to unleash it in a way that would leave no room for silence, no space for denial. Inside the courtroom, the air crackled with tension. Lawyers shuffled papers nervously. Defendants avoided eye contact. Judges sat atop their benches, tired and disinterested. But today, they would not remain indifferent for long. Today, they would be forced to confront the uncomfortable truths that had been whispered in corners and shouted in streets but never fully reckoned with inside these walls. As Elijah took his place before the bench, Miller hovered nearby, his confidence already starting to crack. Because deep down, even men like him know when a storm is coming, when the weight of truth is about to come crashing down on the carefully built lies that protected them for so long. What none of them realized yet was that Elijah Carter was not here just to pay a fine or endure another quiet injustice. He was here to change the story. And what he was about to reveal would tear through the walls of that courthouse like a fire, burning away the silence and leaving only one question on everyone's lips: how could they have ever thought a man like Elijah Carter would let them get away with it? Elijah stood firm in front of the judge, his heart pounding not with fear but with a slow-burning fury, the kind that simmers deep and steady, refusing to be rushed. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs, every eye locked on him, every whisper thick with confusion and curiosity. The judge, a middle-aged man with graying hair and tired eyes named Judge Malcolm Reeves, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward slightly, sensing that whatever was about to happen was not written anywhere in the docket. Officer Travis Miller stood off to the side, his arms crossed, his jaw tight, the first cracks of doubt beginning to show in his posture as he shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. "I'm here to settle a fine," Elijah said calmly, his voice carrying just enough weight to still the restless shifting of papers and chairs around the room. "But before I do, I need this court to hear something. Something it's forgotten." Judge Reeves frowned, tapping his pen against the desk, a small sign of impatience. "Sir, this is highly irregular," he muttered, but something in Elijah's stance kept him from shutting it down completely. There was authority there, not granted by the court, but earned in places far removed from the sterile linoleum floors and flickering lights of this building. "I believe this court should hear it," Elijah said, his gaze never wavering, never blinking, and there was something so solid, so deeply rooted in him, that even Reeves found himself nodding, giving him the floor with a reluctant wave of his hand. Elijah reached slowly into his folder, pulling out documents, old photographs, service records, medals. He laid them gently on the clerk's desk, one by one, as if building a case brick by brick, each piece of paper a testament, each medal a silent scream. He spoke of his service, not with pride, but with precision, recounting battles and missions, the lives saved, the friends lost, the moments of terror that shaped him into something stronger than any hatred could break. As he spoke, the energy in the room shifted. What had begun as a mundane administrative day was now thick with a tension that wrapped itself around every neck, squeezing tighter with every word he spoke. The clerk stopped typing. The bailiffs stopped whispering. Even the lawyers, usually too jaded to care, leaned forward, drawn in by the undeniable gravity of his truth. Travis Miller shifted again, his face flushing red as the weight of Elijah's story pressed down on him like a judgment he couldn't escape. He interrupted suddenly, his voice loud and defensive. "What's this got to do with anything? He's just trying to make himself look good. This ain't a war zone, old man. This is a court of law." Elijah turned his head slowly, fixing Miller with a look so cold, so utterly devoid of fear, that it cut through the officer's bluster like a knife. "It has everything to do with it," Elijah said, his voice low, almost a growl, "because men like you think a badge gives you the right to forget who you're supposed to serve. Because men like you think respect is something you can demand, instead of something you have to earn." The room was deathly silent after that, the only sound the soft hum of the air conditioning struggling against the heat of the moment. Judge Reeves cleared his throat awkwardly but didn't dare interrupt. Even he seemed trapped by the slow, inexorable build of Elijah's words, like watching a storm gather strength over distant mountains. "I stood up for this country when it called," Elijah continued, turning back to face the courtroom, his voice gaining strength with every syllable. "I bled for it. I buried friends for it. And yet here I am, 74 years old, still having to stand up and prove I deserve the respect that was supposed to be mine the moment I put on that uniform." A woman in the back row wiped tears from her eyes. A young black man near the aisle nodded silently, his fists clenched in his lap. Even the reporters who had trickled into the room by now, sensing something explosive was happening, sat motionless, their cameras forgotten for the moment, their pens still. Miller scoffed loudly, trying to regain the crumbling facade of authority. "You think some old medals make you better than the law," he spat. "You think your sob story means you get a free pass to do whatever you want." Elijah shook his head slowly, his expression unreadable. "No," he said, "I don't think it makes me better than the law. I think it means I understand the law better than you ever will. Because I fought for it. I watched brothers die for it. And I watched men like you twist it for your own comfort. The judge finally found his voice, though it cracked slightly when he spoke. Officer Miller, he said, his tone dangerously close to reprimand, I suggest you remain silent unless spoken to. Miller's mouth snapped shut, but the anger smoldered in his eyes, a fire he couldn't hide, a fire that had driven him to punch an old man in public, believing he could get away with it because history had taught him that men like Elijah weren't supposed to fight back. Elijah didn't look at him again. He focused on the room, the people, the very walls that seemed to lean closer to hear his words. He spoke of the incident, the pull-over, the baseless fine, the humiliation of being treated like a criminal after a lifetime of sacrifice. He didn't embellish. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't need to. The truth, laid bare, was more powerful than any dramatization could ever be. The prosecution side sat in stone silence, realizing the optics of what was unfolding. They realized that whatever minor infraction Elijah was supposedly guilty of was dwarfed by the giant, undeniable injustice that Miller had committed, and that they had all been complicit in trying to sweep under the rug. As Elijah finished laying out his evidence, his documentation, his medals, he placed the final piece, a faded letter, yellowed with age, onto the clerk's desk. It was a personal letter from a former president, thanking him for his bravery in one of the bloodiest battles of the last war. The judge stared at it for a long moment, his face inscrutable. The silence stretched so long it felt like a physical thing, a heavy fog pressing down on everyone. Finally, Elijah spoke again, softer now but no less powerful. You have a choice to make, he said, will you be the court that ignores injustice because it's easier? Or will you be the court that stands up, finally, for what's right? The words hung there, vibrating in the still air, daring anyone to challenge them. Travis Miller looked like he wanted to speak, to defend himself, but no words came. His mouth opened, then closed again, his chest heaving with silent fury and shame. For the first time, perhaps in his entire career, he realized he was no longer in control of the story. The judge cleared his throat, glanced at the papers, then looked at Elijah, really looked at him, maybe for the first time seeing the man, not just the skin. This court will take a brief recess, he said finally, his voice thick. As the courtroom doors swung open and people began to file out, whispers erupted, not just gossip but a gathering storm, a rising tide that would not be silenced this time. Elijah remained seated, his posture calm, his eyes steady. He knew it wasn't over. He knew the real battle was still ahead. The weight of decades pressed down on his shoulders, but he bore it the way he always had, not as a burden, but as proof that he had survived when so many had been crushed. Miller stalked out of the courtroom, his shoulders stiff, but the swagger was gone. The courtroom buzzed behind him, and outside, the first reporters began gathering in the sunlight, their microphones ready, their cameras trained on the courthouse steps. Something big was coming. Something that would shatter the illusions people clung to about fairness, about justice, about who the real heroes were. Elijah watched the door close behind Miller, and in that moment, he allowed himself a small, knowing smile. Because he wasn't done. Not even close. And when the truth finally exploded into the open, it would leave no one untouched. The real storm was still gathering, and soon, the entire country would hear its thunder. The recess dragged longer than expected, the weight of anticipation pressing down harder with each ticking second. Elijah remained seated, his hands folded neatly in his lap, as the murmurs grew louder beyond the heavy oak doors. When the judge finally returned, his robe trailing behind him, there was a tightness to his jaw, a stiffness to his movements that hadn't been there before. Something had shifted. The air itself felt different, heavier, crackling with unspoken truths that demanded to be set free. The spectators filed back in, their eyes darting between Elijah and Miller, sensing that they were standing on the edge of something irreversible. Judge Reeves cleared his throat, the sound echoing sharply in the cavernous room. Before we proceed, he said slowly, new information has come to light that demands immediate attention. His words hung there, heavy and deliberate, as he motioned toward the court clerk, who stepped forward with a folder clutched tightly in her hands. She handed it to the judge, who opened it carefully, as if the very contents might explode upon contact. Miller shifted uneasily, glancing toward the back of the room where a group of unfamiliar faces now stood, men and women in crisp suits, badges glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. They weren't part of the local police. They were federal investigators, summoned by a single phone call made during the recess, triggered by the evidence Elijah had quietly handed over without a word to anyone else. The judge spoke again, this time his voice sharper, less willing to entertain denials. It has come to our attention that Officer Miller is currently under investigation by the Department of Justice for multiple civil rights violations, including the unlawful use of force and racial discrimination. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Cameras clicked furiously. Miller paled visibly, his bravado crumbling with each syllable that struck him like a hammer to the chest. Elijah said nothing. He simply sat there, his calm presence louder than any outburst could have been. Miller found his voice, but it was strained, desperate. "This is ridiculous," he barked, his words tumbling over each other. "This is a setup. Some old man's word against mine. You're gonna believe him over me?" One of the federal agents stepped forward, his voice measured, professional, but carrying a lethal finality. "We have more than his word, Officer Miller. We have footage. Testimonies. Complaints that were conveniently buried until now." The agent's eyes flicked toward Elijah with a brief nod of acknowledgement. "Thanks to Mr. Carter's courage, a lot of truths are finally seeing the light." The judge tapped his gavel once, silencing the rising hum of voices. "Officer Miller, you are hereby placed under arrest for charges pending federal investigation. You will be remanded into custody immediately." The bailiffs approached, hesitant but firm, their loyalty no longer clouded by the old rules of silence and complicity. Miller backed away instinctively, his hands raised slightly, a wild look in his eyes. "You can't do this," he shouted, the words thick with disbelief. "I'm the law." Elijah finally rose to his feet, every movement deliberate, heavy with the gravity of the moment. He faced Miller fully now, no barriers between them, no walls to hide behind. His voice was low but carried the power of 1,000 silenced cries. "You forgot," Elijah said, "the law isn't yours to wield. It's everyone's to uphold. You turned it into a weapon against the very people you swore to protect." Miller shook his head frantically, as if trying to shake loose the reality closing in around him. "You set me up," he hissed, bitterness dripping from every word. Elijah took a slow step closer, his presence filling the space between them with a dignity so vast it left no room for hatred. "You set yourself up," he said simply, and there was no triumph in his tone, only the weight of a truth too long ignored. The bailiffs cuffed Miller's wrists with a final snap, and for the first time in his career, he felt the sting of steel meant for criminals, not heroes. His head hung low as he was escorted from the room, the cameras capturing every humiliating step. Outside, the press surged forward, microphones and cameras pointed like weapons, questions flying faster than he could dodge. Elijah stood there, motionless, watching as the man who had thought himself invincible was stripped bare before the world. But he didn't savor the moment. He didn't gloat. His eyes remained steady, focused not on vengeance but on the larger battle still ahead. This wasn't about one man. It was about all the moments that had led to this one, about every silent injustice, every buried story, every quiet surrender that had been demanded of people like him. Judge Reeves called the court back to order, his voice steadier now, as if he too had been galvanized by what he had witnessed. "Mr. Carter," he said, addressing Elijah with a newfound respect that resonated in every syllable, "on behalf of this court, and this country, I offer a sincere apology. You should not have had to endure what you did. We cannot change the past, but we can and must do better moving forward." Elijah inclined his head slightly, accepting the words without bitterness but also without illusions. Apologies were important, but they were only the beginning. True change demanded more. The judge continued, "Your fine is dismissed. This court recognizes your service and the injustices you have faced. Furthermore, We are ordering an immediate review of all cases handled by Officer Miller, and an independent oversight committee will be established to prevent abuses like this from ever happening again." A ripple of murmured approval swept through the courtroom. Elijah finally allowed himself a small, tired smile, not of victory, but of vindication. Outside, as he stepped into the blinding sunlight, the crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. Reporters shouted questions, flashes exploded like fireworks, but Elijah moved through it all with the same quiet dignity that had carried him through jungles, deserts, and now, courtrooms. A young reporter managed to push through the throng, holding out her microphone with trembling hands. "Mr. Carter," she called out, "what do you have to say to the people watching today?" Elijah paused, turning to face her fully. His voice, when it came, was soft but carried to every ear straining to hear. "Never let anyone tell you your story doesn't matter," he said. "Never believe that your dignity can be taken from you with a punch or a lie. Stand up. Speak out. Because the only way to change the story, is to write it yourself." The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, a sound that followed Elijah as he walked slowly down the courthouse steps, his shadow long and unbroken under the afternoon sun. And somewhere, deep within the tangled corridors of power and prejudice, a crack had formed, small at first, but growing, spreading, reaching for the light. The real change had only just begun. And the best was yet to come. As Elijah stepped further into the daylight, the crowd's energy wrapped around him, a mixture of admiration, sorrow, and the heavy weight of overdue respect. Flashes from cameras burst like small lightning strikes, capturing every angle of a man who had spent most of his life unseen, whose battles had been fought quietly until today. Every journalist wanted a piece of him, every network craved a soundbite, but Elijah moved with a kind of sacred slowness, making it clear without words that he would not be rushed, not now, not after everything. From the edge of the courthouse steps, a soft voice called out his name, and Elijah turned to find Maya, his granddaughter, pushing through the crowd with tears glistening in her wide brown eyes. She threw her arms around him, clutching him fiercely, and for a long moment, Elijah let the weight of the years melt away in her embrace. "Grandpa," she whispered, her voice trembling, "you did it. You made them see." Elijah stroked her hair gently, his voice rough with emotion he refused to hide anymore. "I didn't do it for them," he said softly. "I did it for you. For everyone coming after me. So you wouldn't have to stand where I stood." Maya pulled back slightly, searching his face, and what she found there wasn't anger or bitterness, but something far stronger, resilience tempered by hope. The kind of hope that refuses to die even after a lifetime of disappointment. The kind that is reborn every time someone dares to stand up and demand to be seen. From the crowd, a man in a charcoal gray suit approached cautiously, clearing his throat before speaking. "Mr. Carter," he said respectfully, "I'm Assistant District Attorney Sam Whitaker. I just wanted to personally apologize for what happened to you, and to thank you. Your bravery has opened an investigation that should have been started a long time ago. We're reviewing dozens of complaints that were ignored or buried. You started something today." Elijah studied him for a long moment before replying. His voice was steady, but each word carried the weight of generations. "Then don't let it end with me," he said. "Don't let this be another story you forget when the cameras turn away." Whitaker nodded, the sincerity in his eyes real and rare. "We won't," he promised quietly. "I won't." Inside the courthouse, chaos had erupted behind the closed doors. Travis Miller sat hunched in a holding cell, his hands cuffed, his mind spinning faster than he could control. Anger, fear, humiliation, they twisted inside him, an ugly storm of emotions he had no tools to handle. A young officer leaned into the bars, a hint of something like pity crossing his face. "You had everything," the officer said quietly. "You threw it away." Miller lashed out, banging his fists against the steel, his voice raw with desperation. "You don't know what it's like," he shouted. "They never respect us. They never listen unless you make them listen." The officer shook his head slowly, sadness creasing his features. Respect isn't forced, he said. It's earned. You forgot that. The word stung more than any punishment they could hand down, and Miller slumped back against the wall, his bravado finally shattered, his future evaporating like smoke in the afternoon heat. Meanwhile, Elijah sat on a bench under an ancient oak tree just beyond the courthouse steps, Maya nestled beside him, her small hand clasped in his. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself a moment of peace, letting the wind rustle through the leaves above, the sound like a hymn whispered by unseen voices. A news crew approached cautiously, and after a moment's hesitation, Elijah nodded once, allowing them to record. The reporter, a young black woman with sharp eyes and a steady hand, kneeled before him, leveling the camera so that the world would see him properly, not as a victim, not as a curiosity, but as a man. "Mr. Carter," she said gently, "what would you say to the young people watching today who feel like their voices don't matter?" Elijah thought for a moment, the memories flooding him, memories of marches, of shouts met with silence, of dreams deferred again and again. He looked directly into the camera, and when he spoke, it was with a clarity and strength that seemed to carry across every invisible barrier. "I would tell them," he said slowly, "that every step matters. Every time you stand up, even when your knees shake, it matters. Every time you speak, even when your voice trembles, it matters. They'll try to silence you. They'll try to shame you. They'll try to make you believe you're invisible. But you are not. You are the heartbeat of change. Don't ever forget that." The reporter blinked rapidly, struggling to keep her composure, and mouthed a silent "thank you" before signaling the cameraman to stop recording. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the courthouse in deep gold and long shadows, an official car pulled up to the curb. A sharply dressed woman stepped out. It was a representative from the governor's office, carrying a small velvet box and a crisp white envelope. She approached Elijah with a solemn expression and extended the items with both hands. "Mr. Carter," she said formally, "on behalf of the state, and with the endorsement of the president himself, we wish to honor your service and apologize for the injustices you have suffered. Inside this box is the Presidential Medal of Freedom, awarded posthumously to many, but you are very much alive to receive it yourself." The crowd gasped softly, and even Maya covered her mouth in shock. Elijah accepted the box with trembling hands, his throat tight with emotion he couldn't quite voice. For a long moment, he simply stared at it, the weight of what it symbolized almost too much to bear. Finally, he lifted his head, his eyes glistening. "I didn't do it for medals," he said hoarsely. "I did it because it was right. I fought there. I fought here. And I'll keep fighting until the day they have nothing left to fight against." The representative nodded, tears slipping down her own cheeks as she placed a hand over her heart in silent respect. The cameras captured every second, but for Elijah, it wasn't about the footage, or the headlines, or even the vindication. It was about the quiet voice inside that had refused to die no matter how many times the world tried to smother it. It was about standing not for glory, but for dignity. Not for revenge, but for justice. As the crowd began to disperse, lingering in small groups to talk about what they had witnessed, Maya squeezed Elijah's hand and whispered, "Grandpa, you're a hero." Elijah smiled at her, his voice rough but warm. "No," he said, "I'm just a man who refused to stay silent." Above them, the oak tree rustled again, as if the very earth itself acknowledged the truth of his words. And somewhere, across the city and beyond, others who had once been too afraid to stand, too tired to speak, felt something stirring in their own hearts, a spark, a fire, a beginning. Because one man's stand had cracked open a door that would never be shut again. And soon, the entire world would feel its power. The weight of everything that had unfolded inside the courthouse lingered in the air long after the last gavel strike had faded. Elijah could feel it in the way people looked at him now, not with pity, but with something far more complicated, something closer to reverence mixed with a heavy, aching shame. It was the kind of look that said, "We should have stood with you sooner," the kind of look that carried a silent acknowledgement that injustice had lived among them for too long, unchecked and unchallenged. Elijah did not bask in their admiration. He did not revel in the overdue recognition. Instead, he carried it like he had carried everything else in his life, with a quiet, unwavering dignity that demanded no celebration, only change. Walking down the courthouse steps, he could hear the shifting conversations behind him. People talking about systemic failures, about accountability, about the possibility that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't going to be just another story that burned hot for a few days and then faded into comfortable silence. For the first time in a long time, Elijah felt the weight of history tilt slightly in a different direction, but he also knew that a few headlines and a medal were not the end. They were merely the beginning of a larger, messier, and far more dangerous fight for the soul of the place he had called home for 7 decades. Maya remained close at his side, her presence grounding him as emotions swirled all around. She glanced up at him with worry etched into her features, and after a long pause, she asked in a soft voice meant only for him, "What happens now, Grandpa? Will they really change, or are they just pretending for the cameras?" Elijah considered her words carefully, weighing them the way he had once weighed every life-and-death decision on the battlefield. "Change doesn't happen because people are scared of cameras," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "It happens when they're scared of themselves, of what they see when they look in the mirror and can't hide from it anymore. Some will change because they have no choice. Others won't. Our job isn't to wait for them. It's to keep pushing until they can't stand still." Maya nodded slowly, her young eyes old with understanding. They walked together toward the car, moving slowly, savoring the small, hard-earned victory while knowing that the battle was far from over. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, Travis Miller sat in a small interview room, wrists still cuffed, the walls pressing in on him like the closing jaws of a trap he had walked into by his own arrogance. A federal investigator sat across from him, his face calm, professional, but unrelenting. A recorder sat between them, its tiny red light blinking mercilessly. "You have 2 options," the investigator said, his voice even. "You can cooperate and tell us everything, every name, every incident, every cover-up, or you can take this whole fall alone." Miller scoffed bitterly, trying to summon the bravado that had once made men and women alike flinch under his gaze, but it wasn't there anymore. "You think they'll listen to me now?" he muttered, his voice cracking. "You think I can talk my way out after that old man made a damn hero out of himself?" The investigator didn't blink. "We're not here to offer you sympathy. We're here to offer you a choice. Talk, and maybe save yourself a life sentence. Stay silent, and you'll rot while the others keep pretending they were never part of it." The dilemma gnawed at Miller more fiercely than he wanted to admit. The system he had trusted to protect him, the same system that had let complaints slip quietly into closed files, the same system that had reassured him he was untouchable, was now poised to use him as the scapegoat, to cleanse its public image with his downfall. Loyalty to that system had earned him nothing but shackles and silence. The investigator leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "They will erase you to save themselves. You were never more than a pawn to them. If you think they'll come for you, you're a fool." Miller's hands tightened into fists, the cuffs clinking softly against the table. In that moment, he faced a bitter, inescapable truth: the very structures he had upheld with such vicious loyalty would not even remember his name once he was gone. Outside, the city stirred uneasily. News reports played in every bar, every living room, every diner. Elijah's story was spreading like wildfire. People debated heatedly, some defending the system with tired, hollow arguments, others demanding accountability with fresh, fiery anger. Protests began forming, peaceful but powerful, carrying signs bearing Elijah's name, his face, his words. He had become more than a man. He had become a movement. That evening, Elijah sat on the front porch of his modest home, Maya beside him, both watching the sun set behind the city skyline tinged with orange and gold. The world felt different, yet painfully familiar. His neighbors stopped by one, bringing food, offering hugs, sharing stories of their own small battles, their own private humiliations that had never made the news but weighed just as heavily on their hearts. An older man named Mr. Jenkins, whose limp spoke of injuries that never made it into official reports, sat beside Elijah, sipping slowly from a cup of sweet tea. "You cracked something open today," he said after a long silence. "But the real question is, can we hold it open long enough for real change to crawl through?" Elijah nodded slowly, his eyes distant but sharp. "It's not about holding it open anymore," he said. "It's about kicking it off the damn hinges." Maya laughed softly, a sound filled with hope, and rested her head against Elijah's shoulder. But even in the warmth of that moment, Elijah's mind remained troubled. He knew better than most that symbolic victories could be weaponized just as easily as defeats. Already, there were whispers from powerful corners trying to spin the narrative that Miller was a rogue, an exception, not a symptom. That Elijah's story was inspiring, but not indicative of deeper rot. He could hear the arguments before they even started, the polished pundits and smiling politicians framing the conversation carefully, surgically removing the uncomfortable truths to preserve the illusion that justice was working just fine. That angered Elijah more than the punch ever had. Because he hadn't fought for a medal. He hadn't fought for apologies or headlines. He had fought to drag the truth, kicking and screaming if necessary, into the light where it could no longer be denied. As night settled over the city, Elijah received an unexpected visitor. Judge Reeves himself pulled up in an unmarked car, stepping onto the porch with a hesitation that betrayed the conflict raging inside him. He carried a folder under his arm, thick and worn, and when he extended it toward Elijah, his hand trembled slightly. "I found these," Reeves said quietly. "Old complaints, buried files, things I should have paid more attention to. Things we all should have." Elijah accepted the folder silently, flipping it open to reveal a litany of names, dates, and details, a silent graveyard of injustices left unanswered. He glanced up at the judge, his gaze heavy with expectation. "I want to fix it," Reeves said, his voice cracking under the weight of years of inaction. "But I don't know if I can. I don't know if it's enough." Elijah closed the folder gently and set it beside him. "It's not about fixing everything overnight," he said. "It's about choosing, every day, not to be part of the silence anymore." Reeves nodded, his face pale but resolute. "Then I'm choosing," he said simply. The two men sat there for a long while, the unspoken acknowledgement between them deeper than any apology could ever be. It was a beginning, small and fragile, but real. And as Elijah gazed out into the night, he knew that the story was far from over. Because the hardest battles were never the ones fought in courtrooms or on battlefields. The hardest battles were fought in the quiet spaces, in the hearts and minds of those who had the power to either look away, or finally, painfully, choose to see. The days following the trial moved like a slow tide pulling the city into uncharted waters, each new headline stirring waves of reactions that rippled far beyond the courthouse steps where it had all begun. Elijah watched it unfold from the quiet of his living room, the television screen flickering with images of marches, interviews, heated debates where people argued over what justice meant and whether it had really been served. His name had become a symbol, his story lifted up by people desperate for a hero they could rally behind, but Elijah knew better than to believe in simple heroes or easy victories. Every time a commentator praised his courage, every time a politician invoked his name in a speech, Elijah could feel the burden growing heavier on his shoulders, reminder that symbols are easier to celebrate than to live up to. Sitting across from him, Maya scrolled through her phone, her face shifting between pride and exhaustion as she read the endless flood of messages and articles. "They're calling you a legend, Grandpa," she said, her voice a mix of awe and worry. "They're saying you changed everything." Elijah leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin, his eyes dark and thoughtful. "I didn't change everything," he said quietly. "I cracked the door open. It's up to them if they have the courage to walk through it." The knock at the door came late that evening, sharp and urgent. Elijah rose slowly, feeling the creak of his joints, the protest of old bones that had carried him through battles far less visible but no less brutal than this one. When he opened the door, he found a group of young activists standing there, their faces eager, their hands clutching pamphlets and posters, their eyes bright with the kind of fire that only comes from believing, deeply and absolutely, that change is possible. Mr. Carter, the leader, a young man with a defiant set to his jaw, said respectfully, "We're organizing a march next weekend. We want you to lead it. We want the world to see the man who showed us how to stand up." Elijah looked at them, feeling the pull of their hope, the aching desire for validation, for a symbol they could rally behind. For a moment, he hesitated, the weight of responsibility sitting heavy in his chest. Then he shook his head gently. "This fight isn't about one man," he said, his voice steady but kind. "It never was. It's about all of us. If you want to march, march because you believe in something bigger than me. March because you believe in yourselves." The young man opened his mouth to protest, but Elijah cut him off with a raised hand. "I'll be there," he said. "But I'll be marching with you, not in front of you." The activists nodded, understanding more from what he didn't say than what he did. They thanked him and left, their spirits undiminished, perhaps even strengthened by the reminder that true movements are leaderless at heart, fueled not by one face, but by many voices rising together. Later that night, as the house settled into a heavy silence, Maya sat beside Elijah on the porch, her head resting against his shoulder. The stars stretched overhead, indifferent and eternal, a reminder of how small even the greatest victories can seem against the backdrop of time. She whispered into the darkness, "Are you scared, Grandpa? That things will go back to how they were before?" Elijah exhaled slowly, the night air cool against his skin. "I'm always scared," he admitted, his voice a low rumble. "Not for me. For you. For the ones coming after me. History has a way of trying to heal itself back into the same old wounds. But fear isn't what stops us. It's forgetting. Forgetting why we fought. Forgetting who we lost along the way." Maya squeezed his hand tightly, and they sat there, 2 generations tethered by a bond forged in resilience, staring out into the vast, uncertain future. Meanwhile, within the polished offices of City Hall, urgent meetings were taking place behind closed doors. Officials scrambled to manage the public outcry, to construct narratives that positioned them on the right side of history without acknowledging how complicit they had been until now. Policies were hastily drafted, committees were formed, press releases were written with painstaking care to emphasize their commitment to listening and learning. Judge Reeves found himself at the center of many of these conversations, summoned not because he was trusted, but because he had become unavoidable. He listened to the proposals, the promises, the carefully worded apologies, his face impassive. But inside, something old and bitter gnawed at him, the knowledge that real change was slow, messy, and unwelcome to those who benefited most from the way things were. One evening, Reeves requested a private meeting with Elijah. They sat across from each other at a small diner on the edge of town, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where the jukebox still played old songs for quarters and the coffee tasted like burnt memories. Reeves toyed with his coffee cup for a long moment before speaking. "They want you to endorse their reforms," he said, his voice heavy. "They want your blessing. Your approval." Elijah looked at him with a steady, unblinking gaze. "And what do you want, Judge?" he asked quietly. Reeves flinched, the question hitting harder than he expected. "I want it to mean something," he said. "I want this to be real. Not just words on paper." Elijah nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch between them like a taut wire. "Then make it real," he said. "Don't ask me to do your work for you. Don't ask me to bless something half-finished. If you believe in it, fight for it." Reeves swallowed hard, feeling the truth of the words settle deep into his chest. He nodded once, a small, weary gesture of agreement. As they left the diner, Reeves paused at the door, his hand resting on the worn handle. He turned back to Elijah, his face open, vulnerable. "Thank you," he said simply. Elijah gave him a long, searching look. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just don't stop." In the weeks that followed, the city began to change, slowly and painfully. New policies were enacted, oversight committees were empowered, old cases were reopened. But resistance was fierce, and the backlash from certain quarters was swift and vicious. Anonymous threats began appearing in Elijah's mailbox. "But I don't want to be part of the problem anymore." Elijah rose slowly from his seat, his knees protesting the movement but his spirit firm. He looked at the man, seeing not an enemy, but a reflection of the slow, painful possibility of change. "You start by listening," Elijah said. "By standing up when it's uncomfortable. By teaching the next ones better than we were taught. You start by not turning away." The man nodded, tears spilling down his cheeks, and the room, so often divided by invisible lines, found a rare and fragile unity in that moment. Later, sitting alone on the porch once more, Elijah allowed himself a rare indulgence. He closed his eyes and imagined a future he might never see. A future where Maya could walk into any room, any court, any school, and be seen first for her brilliance, her humanity, not the color of her skin. A future where the battles he had fought would not have to be fought again. And as the night deepened, wrapping the world in its quiet embrace, Elijah whispered into the darkness, a prayer, a promise, and a challenge all at once. Don't let it slip away. Because history was watching. And this time, it would not look away. The days grew heavier, the movement swelling and shifting as momentum wrestled against resistance. Elijah remained a steady figure through it all, not seeking attention, but unable to avoid it either. His face became familiar across news stations and social media feeds, yet he stayed anchored to the small truths, the simple conversations he shared with Maya, the moments of reflection sitting beneath the old oak tree, the letters he received from strangers who had found courage in his story. Each note he read quietly, storing the words deep within a part of himself that still believed change, while slow and fragile, was possible. One afternoon, Maya burst through the front door, breathless with excitement, waving a thick envelope in her hand. "Grandpa," she said, her voice shaking with disbelief, "you've been invited to speak before Congress. They want to hear your testimony." Elijah set down the newspaper he had been pretending to read, his heart pounding not with fear, but with the immense gravity of the opportunity placed before him. He took the envelope from her hands, feeling the weight of it, the responsibility stitched into every fiber of the thick paper. Maya knelt beside his chair, her eyes wide and pleading. "You have to go," she said. "They need to hear it from you. All of it." Elijah studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "If they're finally willing to listen," he said, "then I'll make sure they hear the truth." The journey to Washington was surreal, a whirlwind of cameras flashing in airport terminals, strangers offering hushed words of gratitude, and the uncomfortable sense that history was being written with every step he took. He arrived on Capitol Hill wearing the same well-worn suit he had worn to church for years, refusing offers to be dressed up or packaged neatly for the cameras. He wasn't there to look the part. He was there to speak the truth. When he entered the hearing room, the buzz of conversation fell to a hush. Lawmakers, aides, reporters, all turned to watch him take his seat at the long table, his presence commanding without a word spoken. The chairperson, a woman whose stern face softened slightly when she looked at him, gavelled the session to order. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice respectful but firm, "you may begin when ready." Elijah placed his hands flat on the table, leaning slightly forward, and let his gaze sweep slowly across the room. He saw suspicion in some eyes, guilt in others, but also hope, tentative and trembling, but alive. "I didn't come here today to beg for justice," he began, his voice steady and clear, "or to ask for sympathy. I came to tell you a story. A story about what happens when dignity is stripped away not by accident, but by design." He spoke of his service, of his return to a country that celebrated freedom abroad while denying it at home, of the countless humiliations endured not because he had done anything wrong, but simply because of who he was. He spoke of the day in the courthouse, the punch, the silence, the turning point that had brought him to this room. "But this story," Elijah said, his voice rising, "is not just mine. It belongs to every man and woman who ever had to lower their eyes to survive, to every child who learned too early that their dreams would be treated as dangerous. It belongs to a country still struggling to love all its children equally. Throughout the room, there were visible shifts, some faces hardening defensively, others crumbling under the weight of their own complicity. Elijah let the silence stretch after he finished speaking, forcing them to sit with the discomfort, refusing to offer them the easy out of polished platitudes. A senator leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Mr. Carter," he said cautiously, "what do you propose we do?" Elijah met his gaze without blinking. "You already know what you need to do," he said. "You've known for a long time. The question isn't whether you know. It's whether you have the courage to act." The room fell silent again, but this time it was a different silence, heavier, more meaningful. Elijah could feel the shift, the slow grinding of ancient gears that had resisted movement for too long. After the hearing, as he exited into the bright sunlight, a young congressional aide caught up to him, her face flushed with emotion. "Mr. Carter," she said breathlessly, I wanted to thank you. I didn't realize how deep it went. I didn't realize how much had been ignored." Elijah placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Now you do," he said. "Now the real work begins." Back home, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Crowds gathered outside Elijah's house, not to protest, but to celebrate, to honor the man who had reminded them all that courage isn't about making speeches. It's about standing when every instinct tells you to kneel. One evening, as the sun sank low and the streets filled with candles held by hands of every color, Elijah stepped onto his porch and looked out at the sea of faces. Maya stood beside him, her hand wrapped tightly around his, and together they listened as the crowd began to sing, old freedom songs, songs that had carried generations through darker nights than this one. Elijah's chest ached with a bittersweet pride. He knew the fight was far from over. He knew the road ahead would still be rough and bloody and unforgiving. But for the first time, he felt a deep certainty that he was not walking it alone. As the song swelled, a local pastor stepped forward, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Brother Elijah," he called out, "you've given us more than hope. You've given us a future." Elijah shook his head slowly, humbly. "I didn't give you anything," he said. "We fought for it together." Later that night, Elijah sat once again under the old oak tree, the distant hum of the city settling into a peaceful murmur. Maya joined him, curling up beside him with the ease of a child who knows they are safe. She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the starlight. "Grandpa," she said, "do you think things will really change?" Elijah looked up at the vast sky, the same sky that had watched over every step of his long, hard journey, and let a slow, hopeful smile spread across his face. "They already have," he whispered. "And they will keep changing, as long as we don't forget why we started." And in the quiet, sacred darkness, with the first embers of a new dawn flickering at the horizon, Elijah Carter, soldier, survivor, symbol, closed his eyes and allowed himself to rest, knowing that, at last, the future was moving forward without him having to carry it alone. The seasons shifted quietly as the city settled into its new rhythm, a place still bruised but breathing easier, a place where the cracks in the walls of old injustices had let in the light. Elijah Carter's name had become etched into the living fabric of the community, not as a flawless icon, but as a man who had simply refused to bow, whose quiet defiance had rippled outward and refused to be silenced. Streets once indifferent now bore murals of hope, young children played beneath banners quoting his words, and neighborhood centers hosted forums and workshops aimed not just at healing wounds, but at preventing new ones from being carved. Elijah chose to step away from the spotlight once the hardest battles had been set in motion. Fame had never been his goal, and he wore it awkwardly, like a coat a few sizes too large. Instead, he returned to the places that had always mattered most, the small churches, the aging community centers, the neglected schools, planting seeds not with speeches, but with conversations, one person at a time. He spent quiet mornings teaching local children about history not found in textbooks, afternoons mentoring young activists who burned with passion but needed the temperance of wisdom, and long evenings sharing memories with Maya, who recorded every story, every lesson, with a reverence reserved for sacred things. Maya herself blossomed, her confidence solidified not just by Elijah's example, but by the living proof that standing tall could move mountains. She enrolled in law school, determined to fight for justice in courtrooms not as a victim, but as an architect of a better system. On the day she received her acceptance letter, she ran breathlessly up the porch steps, waving the envelope in triumph. Elijah greeted her with a rare, full laugh, pulling her into a fierce embrace, whispering into her ear, "Make them see, Maya. Make them remember." Meanwhile, Travis Miller faced his reckoning behind concrete walls, his name stripped from plaques and honors, his deeds exposed to the cold scrutiny of a justice system he once believed he could manipulate. The investigation uncovered a grim litany of misconduct, buried cases reopened with painful detail, victims finally given a voice in proceedings where silence had once reigned. Miller's trial was swift and merciless, no carefully curated narrative could shield him now. He was sentenced to a long term, not just for his crimes against Elijah, but for every abuse he had hidden under the guise of authority. In the sterile loneliness of his cell, Miller confronted a life hollowed out by choices he could no longer defend, a cautionary tale living in flesh and regret. Judge Reeves continued his quiet transformation, turning his courtroom into a space feared not for its oppression but respected for its unflinching pursuit of truth. He partnered with local communities to establish oversight committees, implemented reforms that made real, measurable differences, and became known as a rare figure, a man who had once faltered but chose redemption over comfort. He and Elijah maintained an unspoken bond, a connection built not from shared backgrounds, but from a mutual understanding that change, once demanded, could not be allowed to slip away again. The city's police department, once a bastion of unchecked power, underwent a painful but necessary rebirth. New leadership replaced the old, with community representatives embedded into every major decision. Training shifted from tactics of domination to methods rooted in de-escalation and respect. It was not perfect, and it never would be, but it was progress, carved painfully from the stubborn rock of tradition, shaped by the calloused hands of those who refused to accept less. As for Elijah, he found peace not in accolades but in the small, quiet victories, the young boy who approached him shyly to say he wanted to be a lawyer because of him, the elderly woman who whispered her thanks after decades of silence, the ripple effects he would never fully see but had helped set in motion. He spent his last years surrounded by those he loved, watching the world he fought for slowly, stubbornly grow toward the light. One crisp autumn morning, Elijah sat beneath the old oak tree, the same place where he had watched the future tremble on the horizon. The leaves spun lazily down around him, golden and crimson, as Maya sat beside him, a thick textbook open in her lap, her brow furrowed in concentration. She paused, sensing the weight of his gaze, and looked up to find him smiling, a deep, soulful smile filled with the kind of peace that comes only from knowing you have done all you could. "You're going to change the world, Maya," he said softly. She reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly, her voice thick with emotion. "Only because you showed me how, Grandpa." And there, under the endless sky, Elijah Carter closed his eyes and leaned back against the sturdy trunk of the oak, the laughter of children in the distance weaving into the whisper of the wind, carrying his legacy forward into a world still scarred, but healing, because one man had refused to accept that silence was the final answer. Now, reflecting on this journey, I want to invite you, yes, you, to think deeply about the power you hold. Elijah's story is not just about the past. It's about every choice we make when faced with injustice. It's about whether we choose to look away, or to stand tall even when standing costs us everything. How many times have we been silent when our voice could have mattered? How many times have we allowed comfort to outweigh courage? What would you have done in Elijah's place? What will you do the next time injustice stands before you, daring you to stay silent? I invite you to leave your thoughts in the comments. Share with us what part of Elijah's journey touched you the most. Let's create a space where stories like his are not forgotten, but fuel the next generation of change. And if you found strength, inspiration, or even a moment of reflection through this story, please subscribe to Tales of Twist. Here, every story reminds us that resilience, hope, and unexpected turns are not just fiction, they are the heartbeats of real life. Thank you for being here. And remember, your voice matters.